So hello, everyone. I'm Rhoda Shermer, President of the Network for Responsible Public Policy. Welcome to NFRP's fourth program addressing the issue of racism, this time from the perspective of race and class. If interested in the past programs, just go to our videos. They're located on our website, or you can go to YouTube and Vimeo. I want to thank our co-sponsors for their support for this program. Thank you, Academy of Political Science, Issue Voter, Puffin Foundation, and all of you who've made your tax-deductible donation supporting NFRPP's efforts to provide reliable information on contentious issues. We're thrilled to have Professor Ian Haney López as our speaker, and we are thrilled to have our dear friend, Professor Roger Berkowitz, serving as discussant moderator, along with his student, Adrian Costa. Professor Berkowitz is the academic director of the Hannah Arendt Center and professor of politics, philosophy, and human rights at Bard College. Adrian is a senior student at Bard College, majoring in political studies, theater, and performance. Professor Haney López will give his presentation, followed by a discussion with Professor Berkowitz and Adrian. Then, as usual, we will open the room to your questions. So please send your questions in all through the program. So, hello, Ian. Hello, Roger. Hi, Adrian. We can get started. Welcome. And it's an honor to have you all here. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rhoda. And it's great to be back here, although not in person, but to working with you and your organization again. Thrilled to be here and thrilled to be in conversation with Professor Ian Haney López and Adrian Costa. Rhoda already introduced me and Adrian. I'll just say quickly about Professor Ian Haney López. He's the Chief Justice Earl Warren Professor of Public Law at the University of California, Berkeley, my alma mater as well. He's written widely in the areas of race and law. The first book of his that I had known about was Dog Whistle Politics from 2014. And most recently, his book, Merge Left, Fusing Race and Class, Winning Elections and Saving America, came out just last year, and I highly recommend it. I also just want to recommend a website, a series of videos that Professor Ian Haney López has put together. I think there's 12 videos in total. They're incredibly well produced. They're short and they are compelling about the intersection of race and class and how to politically, strategically work through them. They're at the website or on YouTube at race-class-academy.com, and I highly recommend that you all check them out. So without any further ado, I welcome you, Ian, and Ian's going to talk for about 20 minutes, I think, more or less, and then Adrian and I will ask him some questions, and then we'll hear from all of you and bring you guys into the conversation. Ian, you're up.
Thank you so much, Roger. And I'm just laughing because Roger said I'm talking for 20 minutes. I'd agreed to talk for 10 minutes, but he knows I'm an academic. So just whatever an academic agrees to, double it and you're safe. Let me start by saying thank you so much to Rhoda Shermer and the Network for Responsible Public Policy. And thank you also especially to those of you who in the audience who are supporting NFPP. It's so important, these sorts of public conversations, this sort of civic engagement, and it just can't happen without support from audience members. So thank you to all of the audience members. Thank you to Rhoda. Roger, I really appreciate your participating and being in conversation. I'm excited also to talk to Adrian, a student of Roger's, who's engaging around some of my work and has a whole different set of questions to ask. So let me start this way. I want to start with a story. To set the scene, it's early 2016, so Trump is the official candidate of the Republican Party, but it's not clear how the election is going to go. It still looks like it's probably going to be Hillary Clinton. And there's a major trade union is hosting its national retreat. It's in Florida. They've invited me to come and speak to the members. They've given me some very valuable real estate. They've given me a day to talk with what they call their business leaders, which is to say the leaders from each of the 50 states. And we're in this hermetically sealed, Marriott hotel conference rooms, this giant ballroom. We're all around this table, and I look around the table. These are working class men. It's overwhelmingly male, overwhelmingly white. There are a couple of African Americans. By the names, I can tell that there are a few Latinos, so they're quite light-skinned also. And here I am, and I'm a bit nervous because my charge is to talk to them about racism and the unions. And that sense of being nervous in some ways it was very quickly justified, because I stood up and they gave me a sort of a lukewarm welcome. They're not thrilled, and I started by saying, hey, my task here is to talk to you about racism and the fate of labor in America. So let me ask you, is there a racism problem in your union? And there's this kind of this uncomfortable silence, and then there's a smattering of laughter, and there are some sort of sotto voce comments. One person I can hear says, well, there's racism. And somebody across the room says, but it's not a problem. And there's some laughter about that. And this is like, okay, there's racism, that's not a problem. And I understand where they're coming from, because it's pretty clear what they're doing is they're reacting to me as this professor from Berkeley who's a Latino, who studies race and racism in American law and politics. And they think that what I'm there to do is to lecture them about white racism and why white racism is a problem and what they should do about it in order to help communities of color, right? And I really want to emphasize this framework, because this is the framework that I'm about to pivot away. I'm about to pivot away from this framework, and yet this is the framework that almost every conversation about race follows. And it's a framework that says racism is first and foremost a conflict between whites and people of color, that we must address racism to help communities of color, but implicitly not to help whites. Addressing racism isn't going to help whites, it's going to help communities of color. And implicitly, addressing racism is actually going to take something away from whites, perhaps because it faults whites for being racist, or perhaps because if we really take seriously the idea that racism is a white over non-white status hierarchy, whites are going to lose something when they address racism. And you can almost see this sort of mental calculation happening among these union leaders. Again, this union's overwhelmingly white, overwhelmingly male. Their position within the labor movement, yes, it reflects their efforts at unionization. Yes, it reflects all of their hard work, but it also reflects the way in which race privilege and gender privilege have operated and been defended within the labor movement itself. And you can almost see them saying, this is going to be one more lecture to tell me to give up what's mine. And, who is this, this little pencil neck academic from Berkeley who's going to come and waste our day? But that wasn't the lecture I intended to give. Rather, I said, let's talk about what's happened to your union over the last 50 years. Let's talk about what's happened in American politics. And I start by taking them back to 1964. And I say, let's go back to 1964. It's a moment of incredible strength for unions. It is also, though, the last time a Democratic candidate for president is going to win a majority of the white vote. The last time a Democratic candidate for president is going to win a majority of the white vote. That Democratic candidate was Lyndon Johnson. Lyndon Johnson was campaigning, promising folks that he was going to extend the New Deal, turn it into a war on poverty. Let's pause for a moment. You know, what is the New Deal? The New Deal is like so common sense, but it's worth saying it, right? Like exactly what it stood for. The New Deal stood for the idea that government had an important role in regulating the economy. Regulating the economy in a way that protected the power of workers to unionize, regulating the economy in a way that protected people in terms of guaranteeing workplace safety, regulated the economy in the sense of preventing fraud. So regulate the economy, B, create routes of upward mobility. What are routes of upward mobility? Well, there are things like free, excellent college education or excellent K through 12 education or vocational training. But there are also things like home mortgages, right? The economic security that allows one to concentrate on one's work and to pursue and develop one's skills, right? Those are ladders of upward mobility. And finally, that redistributed wealth downward and outward. This is a time of high progressive taxation, that the wealthy paid proportionately more of their wealth and income in taxes, because this was necessary to create a shared prosperity. And this is also, by the way, and I'm saying this to union folks and they know this, this is also the time of the sort of the greatest expansion of the middle class the world had ever seen. And I'm like, okay, and here's Lyndon Johnson, and Lyndon Johnson saying, let's go further. Lyndon Johnson was saying in 1964 that we should end poverty within 12 years. Why 12 years? Because he was looking forward to 1976, the bicentennial of the country, and he was saying to the American voter, what better way to celebrate our 200th birthday than to end poverty in America. Lyndon Johnson wins in a landslide. This is an important story. Lyndon Johnson wins in a landslide. But what happened? And so I say, let's look at his opponent. His opponent is Barry Goldwater. He's a son of a wealthy retail family from Arizona. He hates the New Deal. He wants to roll back activist government back to a time when government primarily facilitated economic winners, primarily protected the wealthy and corporations, didn't regulate the marketplace, didn't provide routes of upward mobility, didn't tax and redistribute wealth. He wants to undo the New Deal. And he lost in a landslide, yes, but he also innovated in a way that has condemned us today. Barry Goldwater understood that his economic position was disastrous, that it was deeply unpopular. So Barry Goldwater said, and this is his faction within the Republican Party, said, what if we disguise our economic agenda? Let's be clear, and let me use this phrase, and I know it's tendentious. What if we disguise what is, in fact, class war? The class war of the rich against working Americans. What if we disguise that instead in a set of appeals to race? What if we say that we stand for states' rights? Understanding that states' rights is code. It pretends to talk about state-federal relationships, but everybody understood in 1964 that it meant the right of Southern states to continue to oppress, subordinate, and humiliate African Americans. What if, Barry Goldwater said, we start talking about freedom of association? That's code too. Everybody understood at the time that that meant the right of Southerners to refuse to do business with African Americans, to exclude them from shops, to exclude them from movie theaters, to assign them to seats in the back of the bus. Right? Barry Goldwater begins to campaign on racial themes. And the scary thing is, Goldwater carries 5 Southern states. He shows that these racial appeals could be used to get people who were diehard Democrats and who were deeply committed to the New Deal to vote for a Republican who was promising to roll back the New Deal. Richard Nixon looks at the results of the 1964 election and he says, Goldwater was onto something. And then Nixon calls it his Southern strategy. He begins to use these racial dog whistles. And I say dog whistles because the metaphor points to coded phrases that on the surface do not directly mention race, states' rights, freedom of association, but that underneath are designed to trigger a sense of racial position, of racial conflict. And Nixon would talk about states' rights, freedom of association. He would also talk about forced busing, as if the issue was putting children on buses rather than the racial integration it was designed to achieve. He would talk about law and order in a way that triggered the conception of people of color and African Americans specifically as criminals. And Nixon, he would call this his Southern strategy. It was a complicated result in 1968, but pretty clear that it was effective. Nixon really doubles down on it for his 1972 re-election campaign, and Richard Nixon wins nationally in an even bigger landslide than Lyndon Johnson in 1964. And this is the tectonic shift in American politics. And this is where I say to the union members, you know who broke for Nixon in 1972? A lot of those were construction workers. A lot of those were union members. A lot of those were members of the white working class who'd previously been solid members of the Democratic New Deal coalition that brought together the white working class, African Americans, and coastal liberals. They began to leave the party in 1972. And then I'm saying to the union members, you know, and here's this other character, and I show them Ronald Reagan. And I'm like, this is Ronald Reagan talking about welfare queens and talking about law and order and crime. And who are the Reagan Democrats? They're your members. And I go on decade by decade, tracing this history until we get up to 2016. And I say to the union leaders, you all know, you've done your internal polling, you know the majority of your members are going to vote for Donald Trump, just like the majority of your members voted for union busting state officials. And I cite in particular Scott Walker out of Wisconsin. I say to the union members, to the union leaders, your members are voting for politicians who are appealing to them on the basis of coded racial stories, but whose actual allegiance is to corporate America and who are dedicated to union busting, right? And then this is the sort of clincher when I say to these union leaders, how many of you see a future for your own children in your union? And very few of them do, because they understand that trade unions are on the ropes. And then I say to them, the number one threat that you and your white families face is racism against people of color. Racism against people of color, yes, it's a huge threat to communities of color, but it is also the number one threat in the lives of working class whites in America right now. And that's where we break. And then that's a 3-hour lecture. I've got all these graphs, and I've got these photos, and I'm showing them what's happening. We break for lunch. We come back for lunch, and this union leadership that in the morning, that at the very start had laughed at the idea that they were going to spend the day, had scoffed at the idea that they would spend the day talking about racism. All of a sudden, they're asking questions like, what is systemic racism? What is cultural racism? What are best steps to integrate? How can we message to our members? How can we get them to see the connection between racial exclusion and union busting elected officials that they themselves are supporting? Now, you know, a couple of caveats there. One, I want to be really clear. I'm not singling out this trade union because they're especially backwards, right? I think that there's this tendency among many liberals to look at the working class and the white working class in particular and single it out for being especially racist, especially backward. You know, there's this weird, frankly, class hierarchy among many liberals that look down on the working class. That is completely the opposite of what I'm trying to do. Indeed, I think it's notable that this union gave me this incredibly valuable real estate, right? This wasn't the Democratic Party or liberal elites or even really foundations. These weren't liberal elites asking me to talk to them. This was unions. And the reason it was unions is because they're actually at the cutting edge of trying to understand the connection between class war and racial division. So they're doing better than most. And I really want to emphasize that point. Two other things I want to emphasize. One, a lot of times when people say we need to think about racism as an element of class war, of divide and conquer, then the very next move is to say, so let's only talk about class and let's not talk about race at all. And I want to be crystal clear, I'm doing the opposite. I'm saying precisely because racial division is the number one, here's my pithy formulation. Racial division is the number one weapon in the class war the rich are winning. Racial division is the number one weapon in the class war the wealthy are winning, comma, and therefore we must build cross-racial solidarity. So I just want to be super clear about that. The therefore is not, so let's ignore race. The therefore is, so let's deal with race. Let's build cross-racial, class-conscious solidarity. That's the most successful way to coalition politics. Last thing I want to mention, I've really framed this remark in terms of unions and especially in terms of a white-dominated union. I want to say, and we'll move to questions and answers pretty quickly, so I'm not going to give this equal time, but I want to say the left is badly divided. And on one side of that divide are what you might call the class left. And the class left are, you know, can be symbolized by this union, usually white-led organizations that, if they're progressive, emphasize economic populism, but don't see how racism is a major threat to their own economic agenda. But the other side of the left is equally as important, and that's what I would call the race left. The racial justice folks, the folks who are organizing to oppose mass incarceration, to oppose mass deportation, to oppose the systematic neglect of communities of color. You think about the Flint water crisis. We need to have a conversation with the race left that is also a challenging conversation, that also asks for people to pivot, to move away from, again, that stance that which is where I used to begin, where I used to start, this stance of seeing racism foremost as a white problem. The race left actually needs to make an important pivot and needs to understand that racism, yeah, there's white over non-white hierarchy, but it's not foremost a white problem. It is foremost a weapon of the rich against all of us. And that pivot is important both analytically, because it's true, but also strategically in terms of what it implies for coalition politics. It means that whites have the same interest as people of color in building cross-racial solidarity, in remedying racial justice, right? It's not that racism affects whites the same way, but racism is nevertheless the principal threat in the lives of whites as well as communities of color. So I really wanted to sort of, you know, we have to have a conversation both about the class left and about the race left. I'm going to wrap up my prefatory remarks right now just by saying part of what the unions asked for was evidence that this sort of a story, that an analysis that said racial division is being used against all of us and that the way forward is for us to build cross-racial, class-conscious solidarity, that would work. So in 2017, and then again just this past year, I helped found and lead a couple of really big national studies. It involved communication specialists, it involved pollsters, focus groups, language testing. And we showed in our research that this message of coming together across racial lines to build power in the face of intentional division is the single most powerful political message available right now. It's stronger than messages of racial fear, and it's stronger than the messages you typically hear from the class left or what the race left. And so we're going to talk some more about that, I'm sure. Last thing, I really do want to emphasize what Roger Berkowitz mentioned, raceclassacademy.com, raceclassacademy.com. So all of these ideas are laid out in my 2 books, Dog Whistle Politics, Emerge Left. Obviously, I would love it if you read those. Please do. But assuming you don't have all that much time and you're pulled in a million directions, and just like the rest of us, this is a tumultuous time, raceclassacademy.com. It's a website, free set of resources, and it's really designed to break these ideas down into digestible chunks. And it's, it's something that you can refer to. There's discussion guides to help deepen the connections and the insights. And from there, you can go and read the book. But I really want to make sure that you know about Race Class Academy as a resource. And I think we'll move to conversation at this point.
Ian, thank you so much. That was great, and I feel redeemed about 20 minutes, so that was good. There's a lot to unpack and a lot to talk about, and I think I am going to try and move us to Q&A soon. But a couple things that I think are worth emphasizing about what you've said that I want to just make sure we push and make people understand and give you a chance to elaborate on. Something that you've said today, that racial division is a weapon, the #1 weapon in a class war. In other places, you make it very clear that racism is a strategy of the powerful. And in saying that, you also say something that some people may find controversial, right? Which is that racism is not about hate. It's not a strategy of hate. There's all these definitions. What is racism, right? And biological racism, systematic racism, hate. And I hear you, and you can tell me if I'm getting this right, saying it's not hate, it's not biological racism anymore, it's not really even systematic racism. Now you can tell me if that's right or not, because you just mentioned it. It's a strategy of the powerful. And I think that's an important point. I'd love you to sort of say a little bit about what you mean by that. And is it right to see you as someone, against the idea of systematic racism or not? I mean, I just want to know how you see that.
It's such a great question. I'm really grateful for the opportunity to clarify the insight here. These different forms of racism are not alternatives. They're not competitors. They're complementary. They work together. Is there interpersonal racism? Yes. Is there racism as bigotry, as hatred? Yes. Is there cultural racism? Yes. Is there systemic racism, understood as racism that is baked into our institutions such that it replicates itself without any intent at all? Absolutely. What I'm trying to get across, though, is that the most important force, the principal force that makes racism so virulent and destructive in the United States today is racism as strategy. And that racism as strategy can be promoted by people who harbor no racial hatred whatsoever. In fact, they can be anti-racist. Now, I say this not to in any way excuse Donald Trump. I think he is also a bigot. I think he also has a long history of institutionalizing racism. So I don't mean to exonerate Donald Trump. So let me instead focus for a second on Bill Clinton. Because I think Bill Clinton is somebody who generally has a good reputation with liberals, generally is credited with being a Democrat who managed to get elected and then reelected while assembling a multiracial coalition. But we need to be crystal clear about what Bill Clinton did. Clinton understood that African Americans, cannot effectively have no alternative but to vote for the Democratic Party or to not vote at all. And not voting at all is a real alternative. So Democrats need to be worried about that. Clinton made modest gestures in terms of welcoming and treating respectfully African-American community. But his principal strategy was to try and reclaim some of the white working class that Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush had peeled away. And his strategy for doing that was to imitate Republican anti-Black racial appeals. So Clinton and Gore said, we're New Democrats. And what is it that New Democrats stood for? They said that stands for ending welfare as a way of life. That was Reagan's welfare queen. Ending welfare as a way of life. For whom is welfare a way of life? Stereotypically, that was a way of saying to whites, welfare is a way of life for Blacks and we're cutting them off. Or Bill Clinton said, we're New Democrats. We are going to crack down on crime. Again, that was Reagan. That was Barry Goldwater and Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan all talking about law and order. And now Bill Clinton is saying the same thing, right? Now, what's happening here? Do I think that Bill Clinton harbored hatred in his heart for African Americans? Not at all. I actually think he was probably deeply conflicted about what he was doing. But I also think he had convinced himself that he had no choice, that if he were going to win office, he would have to bring whites back to the Democratic side of the ledger, and that the only way that he could see to do that would be to pander to racist stereotypes. And now here's this other thing that I want to emphasize. This isn't just racism as strategy in terms of campaign rhetoric. It's Bill Clinton and the Democratic Congress doing much more even than Ronald Reagan and George Bush to build the machinery of mass incarceration, doing much more even than Reagan and Bush to cut the social safety net, to throw people off of welfare, to completely gut the welfare system. If we think about the tremendous violence that is being done against communities of color in terms of mass incarceration, police violence, removing people from their communities, with an effect not just on those who are incarcerated, but on those left behind in those communities as well. And then also the slashing of the safety net, especially as designed to help communities of color. Bill Clinton is an integral part of that. And that's what I mean by saying we have to focus on racism as a strategy of the powerful to really understand where we are 50 years after the achievements of the civil rights movement. Things didn't roll back after the civil rights movement because of inertia, because of systems. Things didn't roll back because white people in general are racist. We haven't lost so much ground because there's some natural, inevitable connection between slavery and Jim Crow and the present, right? And so many racial justice folks use that sort of an analysis. They're sort of like, slavery, Jim Crow, today. It's like, no, deep in the analysis, how did we get from 68 to 2020 in terms of mass incarceration, mass deportation, systematic neglect, deaths from COVID that are much, much higher in communities of color than in white communities? And the principal answer, not the only answer, the principal answer is an electoral competition between Republicans and Democrats about who could do a better job scaring white voters about supposedly dangerous and undeserving people of color. And both parties, much more the Republicans than the Democrats, but both parties engaged in that competition as strategy.
Thank you. And when you talk about strategy, I think you're pretty clear that the strategy is dog whistling, which it might be good to give a definition of at some point, because I'm not sure we did that basic step. So I'll give you an opportunity in a second to do that. But if the strategy is dog whistling, right? In a sense, using coded words, I think, to appeal to people who consciously or unconsciously may not be racist or may be racist, but are attracted to the coded words. Um, um, if that's the strategy, dog whistling politics, you say we can, well, you say that it uses words like free association, right? States' rights, law and order. Are not all of these are bad things? I mean, right? Um, and one of the things you say, and I think is really important for people to hear, is you don't win against dog whistling by saying you're dog whistling or you're racist. So talk a little bit about dog whistling and how to fight it, how to fight dog whistling, how to respond to dog whistling.
So the place to start with understanding dog whistling, and this was a major surprise to me as a researcher, as a scholar of racism, but the place to start is to realize that people are complicated and that they typically hold contradictory ideas, and that applies to almost all of us. And what that means is that almost all of us are simultaneously susceptible to racist fears of people that are rooted deeply in racist stereotypes of some people as dangerous, as inherently violent, as unlike us, other people as innocent and trustworthy and rational, right? Almost all of us are simultaneously susceptible to that sort of deeply internalized racist thinking, and also committed to racially egalitarian values that say racism is wrong, racism is immoral, don't judge a book by its cover, treat all people on the basis of their individual character and temperament, not on the basis of their racial category. Almost all of us simultaneously hold both sets of beliefs. And when I say almost all of us, public polling suggests the number of people who self-identify with white supremacy and the Klan is somewhere between 2 and 6% of all whites, right? 2 and 6%. That's very few. Our own research suggested that there's 18 to 20% of whites who are essentially so steeped in what I would call the sort of Fox News world that they really have organized their world around a deep-seated sense of racial fear, of government betrayal, of confidence in the wealthy in the marketplace, right? That they're not really movable. But, you know, opposite that, there's 20 to 22% of what we would call the progressive base feels warmly towards communities of color, believes in a New Deal activist vision of government, believes that in our current economy, the rules are rigged and that the rich are mainly rich because of circumstances rather than simply or primarily as a matter of individual effort, right? Okay, that's the sort of progressive base, but that still leaves about 60% of the American voters toggling between both racially reactionary and racially progressive views. And this is where dog whistling comes in. Dog whistling is an intentional strategy to trigger fears rooted in racism, but in a way that comes across to people not as racist, but instead as common sense. In other words, it's this sort of massive intentional gaslighting of American voters. It says, wait, we really need to worry about illegals who are coming in caravans to invade us, and we need to emphasize law and order, and there are terrorists who mean us harm. And now, on the surface, none of those phrases say anything about people of color, let alone about a sort of invoking a biological vision of race. Certainly none of them use racial epithets. And so it allows people to say, yeah, I don't want to be blown up. And of course we ought to support the police and law and order. Who can be against that? And, you know, illegals, nobody should break our laws, right? People can understand themselves as being reasonable and common sense. And frankly, a lot of the right-wing dog whistling emphasizes, hey, this is just common sense, as opposed to those crazy radical liberals who are like, open the border and okay. But with just a little bit of critical analysis, we can see stories about illegals, about caravans, about invasion, about Muslim terrorists, that those are basically rooted in racist stereotypes. And indeed, those are far more effective when people don't know immigrants, don't know Muslims, don't know African Americans, right? That's the power of the racism there. That's what's happening with dog whistling. It is toggling between a strategy of triggering fears rooted in racism, but in a way that allows the dog whistle politician, but also the audience, to say to themselves, hey, this isn't racism, right? And then let me just add one point there. A lot of people say of Donald Trump, they say, he can't, he can't go wrong. There's nothing he can't say. That's not true. Here's what Donald Trump cannot do. He cannot start regularly using racist epithets. He cannot switch to an express language of white dominance and use racist epithets. He can't say, I am here to represent the party of the white man. We are under assault by all these, and then a string of racist epithets. We need to circle the wagons and keep out these racial epithets, right? Like, he is telling a story that is operating simultaneously on two levels, triggering racist fears, but convincing people that those fears are common sense and not, this is important, and not violations of these racially egalitarian norms that they also hold. And now this gets us to, how do we fight back? How do we contest dog whistling? So if the people who are moved by dog whistle messages also understand themselves as being against racism, as being for racial equality, then we lose when we say Donald Trump's a racist and so are you for supporting him. Because that's not how they understand themselves. They understand themselves as reacting to common sense. And newsflash, people hate being called a racist when they don't think they're racist. And calling somebody a racist when they don't think they're being racist, that doesn't get them to be like, well, let me reflect critically on what you've just said and I'll evaluate my conscience. That's not how people react. People react by saying, hey, screw you. You're actually racist against me because you're judging me for being a racist when you don't even know me. You don't know my values. You don't know how I've lived my life. And guess what? Donald Trump loves this. He loves it. He loves being called a racist because he immediately turns around and says to his followers, hey, Joe Biden or those crazy liberals or AOC, they just called me a racist. And guess what? They think you're a racist too. They're looking down on you. And this is part of the way that Trump, the supposed billionaire, postures as a populist. He says, I'm with the common working man who's also being judged unfairly by these snooty elites, these snooty radicals. They're calling me a racist when I'm not, right? Okay, that doesn't work. Democrats have learned the wrong lesson though. What many Democrats have learned a couple of lessons from that. One lesson they've learned is, okay, if calling out dog whistle politicians for being racist and their supporters for being racist doesn't work, we should not talk about race at all. And that's the sort of majority opinion. And I'd associate that with the class left. It's a colorblind left. It's a let's not talk about race anymore, because when we talk about race, we lose too many voters, especially white voters. That's the class left. The race left has learned a different message. The race left has learned the message that calling Donald Trump a racist alienates some voters. And their response to it is, what else are we going to do? If they're alienated when we call Donald Trump a racist, well, he is a racist and they're probably racist too. So we don't need him. We're going to have a coalition without racists, and we're certainly not going to temper the way we talk about racism in America so that we can appease the racism of these people who support dog whistle politics, right? So these are two opposite, and I'd say wrong lessons. Either don't talk about it at all or double down on calling Donald Trump a racist, even though it loses white support. And the whole race class approach is saying, those aren't the only two choices. There's a third way. And the third way is to say, Donald Trump isn't a racist in the sense of being a bigot. He's a racist in the sense of being a plutocrat. He is a wealthy, greedy, supposed billionaire whose whole shtick is to get us pointing the finger at each other in terms of racial division while he laughs all the way to the bank. And why is this a big step forward? A, it addresses the racism that Donald Trump is using, and since that is his principal campaign strategy, we must address it. B, it addresses it in a way that doesn't make white people in general the problem, but instead makes whites equal and valued allies in the multiracial coalition that is the only way we can beat this, right? So if you think about it, if you say Donald Trump's a racist and so is his supporters, you're actually adding weight to Trump's frame that the United States is fundamentally locked into a conflict between whites and people of color. But when you turn around and say, the problem is Donald Trump as a plutocrat who is strategically dividing us while he laughs his way to the bank, now that creates a commonality of interests across almost all Americans, a true multiracial 99%. Who are threatened by the same greedy 1/10 of 1% whose strategy is racial division and who we can only defeat by proactively creating a sense of cross-racial solidarity.
Thanks so much, Ian. That's really helpful. I actually just 2 nights ago interviewed Marie Stroder, who's one of the members of Trump's African American Advisory Board, you know, she was very eloquent. You can't call me racist, you know, and I think you have, you know, I think one of the things that you help us understand is how those kind of coalitions, even on the right in the GOP, are emerging, and that's an important part of this. I want to pivot a little bit and bring Adrian and Costa into the conversation. He's a senior at Bard College, writing a senior thesis in theater and in politics on whiteness. And, you know, one of the things Ian says, I'm just going to put this out there and then let Adrian follow up on it, is that the old wages of whiteness argument, right, is no longer valid, at least as I hear you saying it, that today whiteness is as much a burden as it is a wage. And that's I think, a very provocative argument that you make. So I'll let you sit on that for a second. I'm going to let Adrian ask his question. And then we'll, after that, bring in some other people for a Q&A. But Adrian, go on.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Yeah, no, I just wanted to say I appreciate being on this panel and everything like that. But I heard you, Ian, say something about this common sense when you were talking about this dog whistle politics that, you know, let's say theoretically it's common sense that I should cross the street when I see a man of color walking next to me. And that strikes me similar. It strikes me similar to an argument you made in your book, White by Law, which I also suggest everyone should go and get. It's a very interesting and compelling argument. But you kind of talk about this common sense in the litigation of like defining whiteness. When the courts were kind of trying to define whiteness, they kind of relied on this common sense statute, which said that for some reason there was something fundamental about white people that was different than any other race. And then kind of what was born out of that was this, I like to call this not a kinetic definition of whiteness, but more of a negative. As opposed to defining who was in whiteness, it was defining who was not a part of that. And in that structure, kind of insinuated a sort of superiority to whiteness in the legal sense. And that's all kind of predicated on this idea of this is just common sense. And the common sense was kind of coming from a social practice, that society is just the way that it is, and that the legal framework is just kind of mirroring that. So I guess I'm kind of curious about like where that common sense came from. you know, and what your answer is to that. Yeah.
Yeah, that's such a great question. Well, first, let me start by saying we're shifting the conversation right now to a concept called whiteness. Um, it's really an important move analytically, so that we can be crystal clear. The problem we're discussing is not white people in general, and which is to say, it's not people who fall within the category of white as defined in the United States right now, which is, more or less people of exclusive European descent with fair features. That we're not talking about white people. I mean, you think about the heterogeneity of people within that category, it's enormous. That's not what we're talking about. But there is something important to talk about in terms of an ideology, a set of worldviews, a set of understandings and presumptions and attributes that are connected to what we can call whiteness. And part of the reason to focus on whiteness is to focus on the ideology. Part of the reason is to highlight that notions of whiteness are also prevalent in communities of color. And that may seem contradictory at first, because you might think, well, whiteness is going to be an attribute of white people, but it's not. Whiteness is a set of beliefs that elevate those who are lighter over those who are darker. Now, obviously that corresponds to a sense of elevating white people over non-white people, but it also corresponds to dynamics of colorism within communities of color. So being lighter is better than being darker. Even, there are those who believe that within the African American community. Then within the Latino community, there's a long tradition of significant elements of the Latino community insisting that we as a community, in fact, are like European Americans, that we are, in fact, a white ethnic group, that we have nothing in common with African Americans. You see that same dynamic developing within certain Asian American communities. You can see it at a group level, you can see it at an individual level. So when we say the problem is whiteness, it really is a very important move to say, let's look at this set of ideas and how they work in society. Let's not judge people by the category they're in, because the category people are in, that's a social process. People can react in many very different ways. The problem is when people react by embracing whiteness. The problem is when people embrace the idea that they should organize their sense of self and their social relationships to give effect to the idea that lighter is better than darker, right? And now, to Adrian, to your question, what is the role of common sense? Why is this working as common sense? This asks us to think about how racism functions. One of the things that racism is doing, and one of the most important things that racism is trying to explain why barbarous and inhumane treatment of others is actually warranted and legitimate, right? And to make that most clear, if you think about slavery, here you're going to kidnap people from their homes, you're going to transport them thousands of miles, you're going to use brutal violence to take their labor for life, and then their children and their children's children. You're not going to recognize any human relationship. You're not going to recognize human love. You're not going to recognize human suffering. You're going to brutalize these people. You need a story about why that's okay, so that you can live with yourself. Racism's that story. Racism is saying, oh, slavery's okay for them because they're not actually human, right? And likewise with genocide. The genocide of Native Americans. Why is it okay for Europeans to come to North America and then to take land that is already cultivated, that is already worked, to drive people away from their towns and their villages? Why is it okay for Europeans to spread smallpox among a population right? Killing 80, 90% of entire peoples. Why is that okay? Oh, good news, racism, turns out they're not really people, right? And we should be clear, racism's working very similarly today. If you think about a lot of the racism that is aimed at African Americans to explain mass incarceration, to explain why they don't deserve health care, they don't deserve to be protected from the pandemic, or a lot of the racism that's aimed at undocumented immigrants to explain why it's okay that there's such an exploited, marginalized population, right? So that only works if racism is seen as something that is natural and obvious and not a product of our society. Because if it's a product of our society, we have to take responsibility for it. And this is one of the things that Martin Luther King was trying to do. And he had this brilliant line where he says, "What man has done, man can undo." And he's saying that about racism. And what he's saying is, all of these ideas, we made them up. And if we made them up, we can unmake them. Indeed, we must unmake them. But that would be to strip the power from racism. So part of the way that racism has so much power is by pretending that it's not made up at all, that it's simply fact, and that the fact is reflected in biology, or it's reflected in divine will, or it's reflected in a natural order, or it's simply obvious and uncontestable. All of that is insulating racism from the insight that we as a society did this. And that since we as a society did this, we as a society should undo it.
Thanks, Ian. Adrian, I'm almost ready to go to Q&A. Do you want to follow up with one other question, or should I go on to Q&A?
No, yeah, we can go right ahead.
Okay. So there's a lot of there's questions already coming in. If you have questions, feel free to type them in, and I'll see how many we can get to. Ian, there's one from an anonymous attendee that I thought was interesting in light of what we were just talking about. And in a way, it's about, are there good examples of dog whistling? Which is, I think, something you actually talk about in some of your videos. It says, are there examples of dog whistling not to create racial division, but to create racial similarities? And I'm thinking of some ways, some language politicians might use to promote racial identity they share. So that's actually, I think, an important twist, and I'd love you to address that.
Yeah, it's such a great question. And I think that it's, I want to simultaneously lift up the question as this really important question, but also signal that the question points to a very important misunderstanding of dog whistle politics. And I'm not surprised that this misunderstanding is there. It's a misunderstanding that's generated by the metaphor itself, and it's pervasive. So the metaphor of a dog whistle is a whistle that, if you think about it literally, a literal dog whistle is a whistle that sounds at such a high frequency that human ears can't hear it, but dogs can. It's used to train dogs. And as a metaphor, it really seems to point to political speech that is operating on two levels. On one level about race, and on another level completely silent about race. So welfare queen, law and order, illegal aliens, terrorists, all of those terms on their surface, no racial reference, but designed to trigger these sort of racial understandings. Okay, what's the problem with that understanding of dog whistle politics? It focuses on code. It focuses on language that can have multiple meanings, but that's almost all political language. Almost all political language has multiple meanings. And almost every time a politician opens her mouth, he or she is trying to talk to multiple audiences at once using phrases that will resonate differently. Is that a problem? Should we call that dog whistle politics? I know, for example, at one point Barack Obama was addressing a Black audience and he said, "We shall overcome." And that phrase, "we shall overcome," may sound one way to a white audience, but it sounds very different to most people in African-American communities because it resonates with one of the important civil rights hymns from the 1960s, very well known within the African-American community. And people turned around and said, Barack Obama was dog whistling to African-Americans. And it just, I want to pause there and say, do we lose something important? This is a rhetorical question, because obviously the answer is, oh yeah. We lose something important when we say Barack Obama's dog whistling when he says we shall overcome. And Donald Trump is dog whistling when he says they're sending over rapists, right? And what is it that we're losing? What we're losing is Donald Trump's strategy is to intentionally stoke ugly social hatreds. Intentionally stoke ugly social hatreds. Barack Obama is not trying to stoke hatreds. He's trying to build a sense of collective action, a sense of a positive future, a sense of linked fate, right? There's nothing awful and ugly and democratically destructive about we shall overcome. It's code, I get it, it's ambiguous, different audiences hear it differently, but what's the intent? What's its function? It's to build a sense of a future that we're all working toward. Whereas what Donald Trump is doing is he's intentionally trying to trigger destructive social hatreds while using code to pretend that that's not what he's doing at all. And we really need to keep the focus on that demagoguery, right? It's demagoguery. And now I'm saying ugly racial hatreds instead of just racism, because one thing I want to emphasize, I haven't mentioned it, but hopefully it's clear to the audience. This is culture war politics more generally. These hatreds can be race-based, but patriarchy and misogyny, huge element of what's going on in terms of the sorts of social hatreds that are being stoked on the right. Transphobia, homophobia, religious xenophobia. Right? There's all sorts of social hatreds that are being mobilized by what we used to call the party of big business, by the Republican Party, and by the right-wing echo chamber, Fox News, Rush Limbaugh, Laura Ingraham, all of those folks. They are intentionally stoking social hatreds while using code so they can turn around and gaslight all the rest of us and say, I'm not stoking social hatreds, I'm just talking common sense. And I want to make sure that when we talk about dog whistle politics, that we understand that what makes it so democratically destructive is not the fact that it's in code, but rather that it's code designed to hide the intentional triggering of destructive social hatreds.
Thank you, Ian. That's really helpful. There's a series of questions in the chat about strategy. And I know you're a strategic thinker in some way, so I think it's appropriate to ask you these questions. I'm going to name 3 topics that come up in the chat. One is Bernie. How does Bernie and his movement fit in with your strategy around dog whistling and creating a race class program? The second, which I think you've talked a little bit about, but there's obviously more desire to hear you talk about, is the various groups on the left who seem to be at each other's throats. You know, how can they be brought to see something in common? And the third revolves around immigration, especially in talking to a white working class audience. Does immigration complicate attempts to create a race class alliance? So, I mean, there's probably more that's already come up here in the chat, but those are 3 that popped out as strategic questions people would like to hear your response to.
Great questions. So I think that Bernie Sanders individually has shifted over time, and late in the primaries in this round, he really moved toward a race class approach, which is to say, to seeing the connection between class issues and racial division as the primary weapon of the rich, right? But let's back up a second, because it's not where he started, and it's not where many of his followers were. So Bernie Sanders, in some ways, or let's talk about the Sanders supporters, so that this isn't directly connected to Bernie the individual, but the Sanders supporters in the aggregate. They're folks who are what we might call economic populists, who see that the system is rigged, who want a redistribution of wealth. I keep being tempted to say radical or revolutionary, but the truth is, you know, if you think about, Lyndon Johnson won in a landslide proposing to end poverty. And nothing that the Bernie supporters said came even close to saying, we should enact a series of government policies that end poverty in a dozen years, right? So we once supported that. Nothing radical, nothing revolutionary, firmly within the tradition of American politics, as sort of an economic populism that understood that government's role was to actively regulate the marketplace, create routes of upward mobility, and redistribute wealth downward and outward with a goal of ending poverty. Great. That's where a lot of these folks are. How do they react when somebody says Black Lives Matter, police violence, police killings, mass incarceration, we must abolish ICE? Many of these folks on what I'm calling the class left react by saying, hey, I'm with you, but I also recognize that's divisive. If you talk about Black Lives Matter, if you talk about abolish ICE, you're distracting us. You're going to break apart this economic coalition that we could assemble if only you didn't always insist on foregrounding challenging these divisive racial issues. And hey, by the way, our class agenda is actually a racial justice agenda too. And here's that move, right? Because this is a second move. It's a move that says, when we look at communities of color, they're disproportionately poor, which is another way of saying, when we enact our radical class agenda, we're going to disproportionately help communities of color. And you often saw, frankly, Bernie Sanders himself talk in this language. People would say, what about reparations? And Sanders would say, we don't need reparations if we could get, you know, universal free higher education, if we could get universal free health care, if we could get $15 an hour wages, that would disproportionately help communities of color, right? So there's a sort of a economic populism is itself racial justice. But so here you have the class left saying, try not to divide us and distract us by talking about racial justice issues, but it's not that we don't get it, we do get it, and we're actually going to do more for you when we assemble this broad coalition that's going to fight for class justice, right? Okay, so here's the problem. That coalition was shattered when the right started to use racial appeals. That is precisely what dog whistle politics broke apart. That is precisely the New Deal coalition of the white working class and African Americans and coastal liberals that Nixon and Reagan broke. And so now you have these sort of Sanders supporters, or these, you know, Occupy 99%ers who say we can rebuild it, just don't talk about race. And it's like, do you not understand why it broke in the first place? It broke in the first place because race was weaponized against that coalition. Racial divisions already shatter a working class coalition, and you cannot recreate that coalition until you frontally take on racial division, overcome it, and build a sense of cross-racial linked fate. And you're not going to build a sense of cross-racial linked fate by sweeping racism under the rug, right? And so that's the strategy. That's the move. And again, Bernie Sanders got there right in the primaries. More and more at the end of the primaries, he was saying, racial division is bad in America because it is being actively promoted by the 1%. And until we deal with racial division in America, we cannot create a coalition of the 99%. And that's the race class strategy. Let me segue to saying, you know, other groups. I talk about the class left, but you could really talk about just about any progressive group. And in particular, you could talk about the environmental movement. There's a version of the class left argument that exists in the environmental justice movement. And it's a version that says, hey, we need to avert climate collapse. Nothing else is as important as averting climate collapse. And I'm with them so far. I agree, right? I'm living in California, you know, between the fires and the sea level rise. We've got to act now. But then the next move they make is to say, and therefore let's not talk about race. Therefore, let's not talk about class. Let's only organize on the basis of this one single issue. And that's where we part company, because I say to them, do you not understand how the Koch brothers are winning? Do you not understand why Chevron and Exxon are doing so well? They're not doing so well because they're single issue and are promoting this this countervailing norm that says, hey, you know, let's pollute. When you look at the Koch brothers, how did they defeat environmental regulation during the Obama administration? Remember, the Obama administration came in and said, it's going to be a new day in terms of environmental regulation. We're going to cut greenhouse gases. We're going to make sure that we stem climate change. And what did the Koch brothers do? They funded the Tea Party. And who's the Tea Party? A bunch of overwhelmingly white folks agitated by the idea of a Muslim black man in the White House opening the borders to illegals. In other words, the Koch brothers intentionally funded racial fear and conflict in order to elect a bunch of politicians, a bunch of Tea Party Republican candidates whose principal allegiance was to the Koch brothers and other wealthy family dynasties. When you look at Americans for Prosperity, they're incredibly powerful, by the way, in the nomination of Judge Barrett. Who is Judge Barrett? Judge Barrett is a candidate who's being promoted, who's being sold in terms of culture war politics. She is a supporter of patriarchy. She is a supporter of the traditional family. But her main backers are Americans for Prosperity and their big money donors, because she will also vote to protect corporations and to cut back on the power of legislatures to regulate the economy, right? This is their strategy. And so I would say, and I have to the environmental movement, and let me hear, by the way, let me signal, Sunrise Movement totally gets this. I contributed a chapter to the recent Sunrise Movement book on the Green New Deal. Love the Sunrise Movement, love where they're at. Sunrise Movement totally understands you cannot avert climate collapse unless you're also simultaneously dealing with racial justice and with economic justice, because they're all bound together. The major polluters are major polluters because they're rich. They use their money to continue to keep the rich powerful. And their main strategy to empower the rich is to promote social division, culture war politics, race, gender, homophobia, right? So Sunrise, totally there, love it. That's the message for the environmental movement. Frankly, any progressive movement that requires that government act on behalf of people rather than on behalf of concentrated wealth must come to understand that intentional division is the #1 weapon against them, and must, as a result, embrace a politics of creating broad social solidarity, not as a vague ideal, not as something nice to say, but a pragmatic politics of building broad social solidarity, precisely because social division is the #1 weapon that keeps us from being able to harness the power of government for collective action. And there's one other question on immigration. Let me just hit that really quickly. If we talk about immigration or about criminal justice reform as primarily a response to white racism, and primarily an effort to help communities of color. We cannot build a big enough political conversation, a big enough political coalition to actually have enough political power to change those dynamics. And I really want to emphasize that for the racial justice folks. If your number one goal is end mass incarceration, end mass deportation, you need a big political coalition to do that. But you cannot assemble that political coalition. You cannot defeat dog whistle politicians if you frame your argument simply as fighting white racism and helping communities of color. On the other hand, in the study that I just ran that wrapped up in July of this year, I pitched arguments for immigration reform and for criminal justice reform as responses to divide and conquer class war, and making the argument to voters that ending mass incarceration is good for all racial communities, that immigration reform is part of an effort to scapegoat immigrants so that we don't notice the way in which the rich are rigging the rules for themselves. And immigration reform is good for all communities and good for building a cross-racial coalition. Those arguments won. They were the best performing messages among African Americans and Latinos, better than the sort of call out white racism message. And also, those messages won among whites compared to a message of racial fear, we need to worry about immigrants and illegals, right? So this argument that we need to pivot to understanding racism as division that threatens all of us, white folks included, it's not only a way toward economic populism, it's also the most promising route toward racial justice.
There's been as you know, in the last 5 or 6 years, a real sea change in activism around race and race consciousness. Some would say a move away from a kind of coalition building that you're talking about to a more abolitionist or race conscious approach, right? The anti-racist movement. Michelle Alexander in The New Jim Crow talks about how after the Civil War, there was a brief moment of white working class and black working class alliance that got destroyed by, if not dog whistling, at least a corporate alliance that pitted them against each other. And I think there's a lot of people, and this comes out in a couple questions in the chat, this is where it's going, that just are skeptical that this kind of coalition that you're calling for can be, we've tried it many times and it's always failed. Why are you confident that now is a time to try it again?
This is the $1 million question, and I think that your listeners are absolutely right to say, hey, this idea of a multiracial class conscious movement is not new. Don't sell it like it's new. It's actually a really old idea. And I want to emphasize that's completely right. It's Bacon's Rebellion in the 1600s. It's the fusion movement immediately after the Civil War. It's Martin Luther King's Poor People's Movement, and it hasn't worked. Why might this time be different? And this really, for me, picks up a question that Roger, you mentioned earlier and that we left on the table, the wages of whiteness. What are the benefits to whites and to people of color, frankly, who are able to? What are the benefits to folks of organizing their social and economic and political world around whiteness, around the idea that white is better than non-white? And when we ask the question that way, we can begin to think about the wages of whiteness as both material and psychological. Material in the sense that, hey, especially if you think, let's say the 1960s, Martin Luther King trying to organize a poor people's movement, is trying to say to whites, join together with African Americans. We can build a better world, a world that is more democratic, that regulates capitalism more effectively, that ends militarism. And white folks are saying to themselves, perhaps consciously, perhaps unconsciously, what do I have to give up? And what do they have to, right? Access to better schools, access to these high-paying union jobs, access to clubs and workplaces and positions in the military, the officer corps, right? Those are the material benefits. And then on the psychological side, they're saying to themselves, the culture right now elevates me, celebrates me, says I'm innocent and hardworking and deserving, that I built this country, that I am, empowered to govern on behalf of myself and others. I need to give all of that up. I need to say, no, all of that was a lie, that in fact, I'm culturally in the same position as these people who previously have been described as inferior and dangerous and larcenous, and right? Those are the psychological and material wages of whiteness. Look at what's happened to those wages over the last 50 years. On the psychic side, and I want to start there, we have made tremendous progress in the sense that and this is one of the great triumphs of the civil rights movement, to say racism and a belief in white dominance is morally ugly. It's terrible. It's immoral. And again, something like 90+% of Americans believe that, right? That there's something ugly about organizing your life in terms of white dominance or the dominance of people who are lighter. But it's not just that. If you think about sports and culture and entertainment and even politics, the election and re-election of Barack Obama, and I really want to highlight not just Obama, but the Obamas, the entire family, did so much to put the lie to the idea of Black inferiority, did so much to give credit to the idea of a shared humanity that isn't and should not be bound by color lines. Right, so there's sort of, and then at the same time, if you think about like the psychic wages of whiteness today, who is it who's the public, who embodies the sort of public personification of white pride? It's Donald Trump. Donald Trump. And so here's this fulminating, mean-spirited bully, right? Who's angry and who lies and who attacks people, who's just little and vicious and insecure in his public personality. Like, a lot of people look at Donald Trump and say, wow, if that's white pride, no, thank you. That's not who I want to be. That's not how I want to organize. That's not who I want my kids to be, right? Or the marchers in Charlottesville. It's a very ugly public face to white pride, the Proud Boys, right? If that's white pride, no thank you. Okay, so you've got those psychic wages have really reversed and in some ways are quite negative now. But at the same time, what about the material wages? Now, on the one hand, let's be honest, it's still materially, there's a set of advantages that accrue to people who are part of the white category simply as a legacy of racism and the continuing, the continuing power of institutional racism. But when we step back, we can see that as people have organized their political life around defending whiteness for the last 50 years, encouraged to do so by the party of big business, what they've actually done is betrayed their own economic futures. If you want to see, and right, this is the conversation with the unions. This is a conversation about what's happened to pensions, what's happened to minimum wage, what's happened to public education. It used to be free and excellent. Now, the current generation is saddled with incredibly high levels of debt for education that's increasingly out of reach for most people. What happened to all of that? Those are the material consequences of whiteness. The real wages of whiteness today are measured in people who have voted to defend the dominant position of whites in society and have received in return rule by the rich. And that's the challenge. It's not that most people see that immediately or easily, but 2020 might be different than 1968 or than 1868 or than the 1600s, might be different. Because this is the best chance in the last 400 years to convince a majority of Americans that organizing their life in terms of cross-racial solidarity is the best way forward for their own families, that as a pragmatic matter, the best way for people to take care of their own families, to provide for their children, is to organize their lives in terms of their racial ideals of egalitarianism and linked fate. And that doing the opposite, organizing their lives, especially their political life, in terms of racial fear, is actually a recipe for continued rule by the rich, which right now is simultaneously threatening our democracy and leading us and accelerating our path toward climate collapse. Roger, you're on mute.
Sorry, I was just saying that's very powerful, Ian, and I'm sorry I was on mute to say it. We'll have one last question because we're coming to the end from Adrian, who wants to follow up on some of these questions. So Adrian, last question.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. So, you know, I'm hearing a lot about like this class consciousness and this understanding that racism exists as a strategy to kind of reinforce, you know, this hierarchy that exists on materialism, you know, which is I think really it's extremely compelling. But I'm curious about this question of feeling and of like the ephemeral feeling of race. And a lot of what Roger and I have been talking about in relation to the project that I'm working on is, you know, what are people talking about when they talk about this, you know, feeling of racial difference or racial prejudice, because we look at an institution like BARD, which we are a part of, and we don't see any, you know, litigation or any framework, institutional framework that says, you know, Black people have less rights than white people, and yet there's this kind of pressing feeling that defines this, and I think that defines this kind of experience of otherness. And so I guess my question to you is, when looking at, you know, race as a strategy of the rich to protect the very tangible, you know, effects of money and capital, how can we understand the way that racism functions in the emotional, in the ephemeral, in the not so tangible?
That's such a great question, and I want to answer it in a couple ways. You know, first, I want to point again to raceclassacademy.com, because Race Class Academy is, it ends with a set of videos, one that talks about the wages of whiteness, but one that talks about what it would mean for whites to really take seriously the idea that the biggest threat in their lives is racism against people of color. What that would really mean, right? And so a lot of these big questions are things that I try and at least surface in raceclassacademy.com. Now let me answer in another way, and in terms of feelings, I want to be simultaneously really serious about how racism works in America and also genuinely hopeful. And that's a surprise, right? Because, so here's what happens. Almost everybody, and you know, we talked about, you know, the anti-racist movement. So you can think about Ibram Kendi or Ta-Nehisi Coates. Almost everybody is pushing an analysis of race that says racism deeply inheres in our society because it is dominated by whites who have an entrenched commitment to racism. Racism is pervasive, destructive, and damn near permanent. And what that's doing is it's creating both a sense of hopelessness among many people of color, right? Like, this is overwhelming, but also a sense that the appropriate response is one of conflict, that all we can do is speak truth to power, that we're not actually going to have enough power ourselves to change this. This remains a society, and many of our institutions, Bard, I'm sure among them, remain dominated by whites in terms of the culture and the power structure, right? But so then we end up in this position of conflict and despair, right? And meanwhile, whites are in this position of like feeling like they're under attack and that they're being threatened, that they're under threat, you know, feeling very much on the defensive. But aside from an exceptional few, not especially deeply committed to really wrestling with these dynamics. And it right, so that's where that's where the vast majority of race conversations are. And I'm saying that's wrong, and it's wrong analytically and strategically. Analytically, because I think we misunderstand the power of racism when we think it's white people in general. It's not, and it never has been. It never has been. From its inception, racism and capitalism arise together in colonialism as a way in which the plantation class, and let's use the plantation class as a stand-in for the 1%, promote a sense of division so that they can accumulate and concentrate power in themselves. That's what it's always been. It's still that today. But this in turn, I think, can lead to a much more hopeful, even joyful orientation towards race and our racial future. Because what it says is all of us have an interest, a pragmatic interest in fighting racism, in building bridges across racial division, in doing the hard work of dealing with white privilege, doing the hard work of supporting true integration, doing the hard work of engaging in and supporting reparations. All of us, even white folks, have an interest in doing that because that is simply the best and indeed the only way we can provide a survivable world for our children, right? And survivable because of climate collapse, because of impending climate collapse. But I don't mean to end with survivable. We can build a world rooted in joy and curiosity and mutual engagement when we understand that social solidarity must be purposefully built, and we are the ones who must build it. That the most powerful actors in our society understand that the biggest risk to concentrated power is the power of social solidarity, the power of people who see their fates linked. And they are doing everything they can to destroy our sense of linked fate, our sense of social connection with each other. We, each one of us, everybody here, our unions, our foundations, our colleges, Bard itself, must commit to purposefully fostering a sense of social connection among and across every line of division that is being weaponized against us. And that's race, and that's class, and that's gender and sexual orientation and religion. That is the way forward. And it's not only a pragmatic route towards power, but it promises a society rooted in our highest ideals, a society in which we can take joy and pride in being engaged in and taking care of each other and feeling secure that our own humanity, our own dignity will also be recognized and be taken care of, right? And I want to end there because that's a joyful vision. That's a vision, not a naive vision, but a joyful one. We are being intentionally divided. We can commit to purposefully building connections with and taking care of each other because that's the best and indeed the only way to take care of ourselves and our children.
I think that's about as amazing an ending for a conversation on race that we can imagine. They just don't end with joy so much anymore. So I want to commend you for bringing us to joy and to say that, you know, you started out by talking about going into a union meeting, right? And so much of what you're saying and what needs to happen is for people to talk and listen to each other who disagree. You know, even this conversation I mentioned that I had 2 nights ago with this African-American woman on Trump's African-American Advisory Committee. it's so important to figure out how to talk to people like that and people who you disagree with. And the fact that she came and talked to us was great. And these are the kind of conversations we have. And I think that it can lead to the kind of joyful coalitions you're talking about. So I want to thank you, Ian. Thank you, Adrian. And again, thank the Network for Responsible Social Policy that Rhoda runs. And I think Rhoda wants to come on and send us off. So Rhoda, welcome back.
Thank you. I want to do the same. I want to thank you, Ian, you, Roger, you, Adrian, for the most stimulating evening, thought-provoking, and that you left us on that hopeful note is absolutely amazing. And I think we're all grateful for it. So thank you very much. We'll be looking forward to having others take a look at the video when it's completed, and we're definitely going to your academy. So thank you so much.
Bye all. Thank you.
Bye. Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye. Thank you all. Really appreciate this conversation. Take care.